everyone. Welcome to the March 17th, St. Patrick's Day edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragona. I'll be joined very shortly by my co-host, Craig Milkowski. This week, we'll be taking a look back at last weekend's stakes racing, topped by the Rebel Stakes, what was previously a prep for the Kentucky Derby, although I think there'll be many more preps for the Kentucky Derby. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but Oaklawn Park, which carded the Rebel Stakes on Saturday, had a ton of undercard stakes and notable performances that we'll also discuss on this podcast. Move on to Aqueduct and Santa Anita, where especially out in California, we saw a pretty impressive performance by another 3-year-old trained by Bob Baffert, as well as the only grade 1 stakes race of the weekend, the Beholder Mile. And we'll finish things up by talking about some races from Laurel Park, Turfway, and Gulfstream. So, Craig, it's been another wild week in racing and just generally in the country. How are you and your family holding up through all this?
We're doing pretty good. We're definitely practicing our social distancing. Both my wife and I are working from home, as I always do, of course. It's just crazy times. It's hard to say what's going to happen going forward. I know they announced the Derby will be September 5th this morning. Who knows what's really going to happen? A chance to see what the plan is to build up and how the point system's going to work. But we sure are in some interesting times, and it will be something to follow.
Yeah, I mean, for good reason. I think a lot of people are having trouble grasping what the ramifications of all of this could be because there is so much uncertainty out there. And I think it's prudent to plan the Derby for as far away as September 5th, even though it does seem such a long way off, because even the more conservative estimates of when this whole thing could come to an end are predicting that even by early summer, we could still be in a recovery period from this. So we'll see. But I just think a lot of people don't know what's to come. And, I've seen a lot of speculation even this morning about how moving the Derby to later in the year is going to affect the stakes schedule of other racetracks. And I think we just have to kind of let go of all of that. Any stakes schedule that's been announced so far, just consider it tentative or retracted at this point, because I think we're going to see a lot of racing dates shifted around, and hopefully we don't have to break from racing for too long. I know that a lot of tracks are trying to continue without spectators for the time being. We'll see how long that lasts. But I just hope that when all this is said and done, the racing industry can pick back up and get back to some semblance of normalcy.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And the thing you have to say is if some tracks do have to juggle things around, I mean, that's just the way it goes. The Kentucky Derby is the biggest stakes race we want run in this country every year. And people are just going to have to plan around that, I would think.
Yeah, and I think we can, once we get past all of this and, not making light of any the serious nature of this pandemic situation. But I think once we get later in the year, racing is so tied to tradition and doing things the same way year after year, but it could be kind of interesting and fun to talk about how this changing schedule is going to impact racing this year and just trying to stay on top of everything. I think it'll provide a lot of interesting discussion for racing fans, and it'll be some food for thought for how maybe we could do things differently in the future. So hopefully there might be some good to come out of all of this from the racing standpoint. But for now, I just hope that everyone out there is able to stay safe and do what your local officials are telling you to do. Let's move into last week's racing. We'll begin at Oaklawn Park with the Grade 2 Rebel. And to the surprise of not a lot of people, Nadal was up to the test. He was bet down to 4-5, kind of as we expected. He was the heavy favorite in this race. He got quite a challenge, though, throughout the running of this race. Early from American Theorem, a gun around the far turn as the entire field ranged up to challenge him. And then in the stretch, his Accession took a really strong late run at him. But Nadal just refused to yield at any point and held that winning advantage.
It did. It almost seemed like at every point in the race, every horse in the field challenged him at some point. Maybe that wasn't quite true. A few didn't get close to him, but the majority took a run at him at one time or another. Unsurprisingly, the race is coded in red by TimeformUS. The pace figures were really fast. The opening quarter and half mile were over 140s. But Nadal was just very game. It is I want to keep in mind it was over a sloppy track. So you got to maybe take it with a little bit of grain of salt. But he did get an overall 120 TimeformUS speed figure for the effort, which is as good as we've seen in a Derby points race. There's a faster one we're going to talk about a little bit later. That wasn't a points race, but it was quite an interesting day overall. From a speed figure perspective, when I sat down to look at the worksheet, I kind of expected the track to be a little inconsistent given the conditions on the day. But it was a day I found really easy to do figures. It only took me about 5 minutes. All the races lined up, the sprints and the routes. So that part was a pleasant surprise. And I just think it was a really good effort from Nadal. I do still have some reservations that he wants to go much further. His final time figure in this race was only a 113 or 114 actually. And I don't know. He just kind of has a look of more of a miler type to me. I'm curious what you think of that. I'm not trying to detract from this effort at all, but I would still have trouble seeing this horse win the Kentucky Derby.
Yeah, the thing that I'll say about the speed figures, which I do want to expand upon a little bit, is this Rebel Day, I think, is a good example for people to look at why the TimeformUS speed figures can be so valuable. Because I think if you're just making final time speed figures on a day like this, and I mean, I know that the buyer guys must have had some trouble with this day because you have to do, if you're just looking at final times, you would have had to do something to elevate the Rebel performance. Because otherwise you'd be assigning Nadal the lowest final time speed figure of all of the 5 mile and 16th races at Oaklawn on this day because it was the slowest of the 5 races. And if you're not taking pace into consideration, you kind of do have to make the case that the track slowed down later in the day. But as the TimeformUS speed figures point out, there was a legitimate reason why the Rebel and the Azeri, which we're going to talk about, won by Serengeti Empress, had slightly slower final times because the paces of those two races were just significantly faster than the other mile and 16th races on the card. And that often is the explanation for these things. And the TimeformUS speed figures just have that built in to the final number that gets put out.
Yeah, that's true. I haven't looked at what the buyer guys did, for example. I got the impression they probably did a little not playing around, but using different variants for different races. The one benefit that we have is the buyer figures are kind of pigeonholed where whatever you give Nadal, Accession's getting a point or two lower because he was only beaten 3/4 of a length. Where on our speed figures, there's a 7-point gap because he didn't run nearly as quick early in the race. He was far back and kind of got a setup. So that's actually kind of how all the TimeformUS speed figure things got started. Someday when we have a slow day, maybe I can tell that whole story of how it started. But it came right down to situations like this where races were broken out because of pace. And I just decided to do it a different way that I thought more accurately reflected how all the horses in the field run, not just the winner.
That's a really good point. And I'm not knocking the buyers saying that they're doing something that they shouldn't be doing to elevate Nadal's speed figure. They have to put out a speed figure that has utility as well, just like you do. But we're just talking about some of the limitations of doing it that way. And I'm not saying anything groundbreaking here. I know Andy Byer's written that in his books. So that's just the difference between the two methods of doing it. As for Nadal's distance limitations, the one thing that I found encouraging about this Rebel was that he really did seem to re-break at the end of this race when Accession came to him, because Accession had built up quite a bit of momentum at the top of the stretch, and Nadal really separated himself from the rest of the field to meet that challenge. And I saw some people on Twitter speculating that maybe the come home time for Nadal was inaccurate because he had come home so much faster than Serengeti Empress off similar fractions. But I mean, I went back and checked the video, and the times that were posted at Oaklawn looked completely legitimate to me. I mean, Nadal just came home much quicker than Serengeti Empress for that final 16th, I think because he really did accelerate again to meet that challenge of Accession. So that gives me some hope that maybe he's a horse that has more in the tank and can go a bit longer. Whether he's a 1.25 mile horse, I don't know, but he's more than I thought he was originally. So I want to kind of be updating my original opinion of him.
Yeah, our friend Andy Stirling is actually one that questioned the times, and legitimately so. Just looking at them, they didn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. But I went back and timed both of those races, the Serengeti Empress race and the Nadal race, from video, and both of them were spot on. So there were no problems at all with that.
Let's talk about that other mile in the 16th race that took place just before the Rebel, the Azeri, which was won by Serengeti Empress, last year's Kentucky Oaks winner. She just dominated throughout. I mean, I guess she got a bit of a challenge from that riderless horse, Emma, who lost her jockey right out of the starting gate. That one kind of ran off and stayed outside of her for most of the race. But as for the horses that had riders, she was just well ahead of the field for the entire race and never really got a serious challenge.
Yeah, she sure didn't. She wound up with a 121 TimeformUS speed figure, just a little bit higher than Nadal, even though her final time was about a half second faster. But she didn't go slow on the front end. It wasn't quite fast enough to get coded in red, but her pace figures were in the 130. She finished up well. I do think she caught a little bit of a break when Emma dumped the rider at the start. Maybe that one puts even a more strong challenge to her up front with the rider and not, staying kind of off her flank a little bit in the clear. It's really hard to say, but she took full advantage and just had plenty left in the stretch. There wasn't a whole lot of ground being made up on her in the lane. So just a really top effort from her, and it's good to see her back in top form.
Yeah, and I think one of the things you can look at out of performance is that she really did run them off their feet, and the other horses that were chasing her in the early going, like Street Band and Lady Apple. Street Band was actually, I think, closer to the pace than maybe they would have wanted her. I mean, they just fell away one by one, and a long shot got up for third. My Lady Curlin looked like she was going nowhere on the turn. She got up for second. So that's some hallmarks of a performance that might be a bit better than it even seemed, that Serengeti Empress was able to really cause other horses to not be able to finish the race because of the pace that she was setting. And she just seems like among the best fillies and mares that are out there right now. I mean, obviously Midnight Bisou is the top of the division, but I think Serengeti Empress is kind of claiming that position right below her.
Yeah, I would agree with that. The one horse I'd want to watch coming out of here is Street Band. Normally, I have no problem with a rider using more speed on a horse. And in this situation, it was probably the right way if you wanted to win the race for Sophie Doyle with Street Band. But I just think she's a filly that really wants no parts of being up that close that early, particularly when the pace is fast like it was in here. And I'd much prefer to see her drop back and make her one run like she's done in her best races, the Cotillion, and even last time out of Houston.
Yeah, I don't disagree with any of that. We saw a very different race flow in the race that occurred before the Azeri, again at the same distance of a mile and a 16th, as Night Ops overcame what was a pretty slow pace to win the Essex over Snapper Sinclair and Pioneer Spirit, those two pace setters. Credit to the winner for closing down those horses, but there wasn't a whole lot of movement behind him. It was really just kind of a merry-go-round race among the others.
Yeah, it was. He ran a good race. He came in with the best last race TimeformUS speed figure in the field and somehow won and paid 6-1. I'm sure it was because of the pace scenario and how it looked. I didn't bet him because it just looked like he would have nothing to run into. But he was able to sit up close to Snappy Sinclair and Pioneer Spirit, just a couple lengths off, and outkick him home. And he got a 119 TimeformUS speed figure for this effort, and just a solid, I would say that's a grade 3 type number, even though this was a listed stakes.
Yeah, he was the winner of an allowance race that I think we talked about on the TimeformUS forecast about a month ago that looked like it had a stakes quality feel to it. And he came right back out of that race to actually win a stakes. So he is a horse that's in really good form right now for Brad Cox. The rest of the field, they're okay. Like you said, I think maybe a grade 3 quality is their ceiling. And I think they were helped in running a faster final time than some others on this card due to that slower pace. So decent horses. I just don't see them really stepping up above this level anytime soon.
No, in the allowance race you mentioned, the Temperance Hill was won by the runner-up of that race on Friday. It was the first running a mile and a half race, but so it definitely has proven to be a strong race. I think it was Diodoro horse, Sky Promise, who won that one.
Yeah, that was a funny one to watch. We had two of the most notorious deep closers in the game, Campaign and Sky Promise, coming from about 30 lengths out of it to finish first and second in that race. So fun race to watch, but not what we're going to discuss in depth on this podcast. There were two other non-stakes mile and the 16th races at Oaklawn on Saturday. One of them was a maiden race, which was won by Blackberry Wine, a horse who had previously crossed the finish line first on 2 occasions. Obviously, though, he was disqualified out of both of those efforts due to a medication positive issue that occurred with many Joe Sharp horses at the fairgrounds this winter. So Blackberry Wine was once again deemed a maiden, competed against maidens, and ran like a stakes horse.
He sure did. He's definitely a stakes horse. He ran huge. I think the final margin was like 13 lengths in this race. He got a 119 TimeformUS speed figure for the effort, so just a point below what Nadal got on final time. And not a whole lot to say about it. He exploded, which is not unusual for 3-year-olds this time of year. It was a really big effort. I'm not sure what was behind him. Both of the second and third place finishers were first-time starters, so we don't have a lot to go on other than the clock and his big margin of victory. So a big effort, but I'd still want to see him do it again against better competition.
Yeah, what I'll say about this performance is that running against softer competition definitely helps horses achieve faster speed figures just generally because they typically get better trips. And Blackberry Wine has already shown that he's a horse that really responds well to moderate pace situations. He can just kind of click off those 12-second eighths. He didn't handle the situation when they ran fast early quite so well in the Risen Star last time. And also, he's a horse that's shown an affinity for wet tracks in the past. I think he won over that sloppy track on the Kentucky Jockey Club undercard, so you know that he likes this kind of going. So that was all working in Blackberry Wine's favor, but he still ran a really nice race here. So I'll be interested to see where he goes from here, assuming that racing continues. I imagine they'll be straight back into stakes company. The other 3-year-old performance that we saw going a mile on the 16th outside of the stakes action at Oaklawn on Saturday was Tyshawn winning an allowance race, I think just a little bit after Blackberry Wine won his maiden event. This is a race that I think got some people talking that maybe the track was favoring inside speed a little bit at Oaklawn. And I think some people still maintain that later in the day when Serengeti Empress and Nadal won, even though they were favorites. I don't know. I was kind of on the fence about that. I thought it was maybe somewhat situational just given the horses that won. But Tyshawn obviously handled the going and finished up this race pretty impressively.
He did. I was actually a little more impressed with his race than I was with Blackberry Wine, just because he was beating better horses. He was coming out of that Grade 3 Southwest won by Silver Prospector, which we had as a pretty fast race overall on the Triple Crown Trail. And I just thought it was a really good effort from him. He had a really bad trip that day and still ran a 107 TimeformUS speed figure. So his leap to a 116 wasn't something that totally caught me by surprise. I mean, I think he was the favorite in here, so not like it was some, that took everybody a gape, and just couldn't figure it out. Just a good effort from him, and I would imagine he'll be right back in the stakes company again soon based on this one, because he could certainly compete with some good 3-year-olds.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, he's a horse that I actually was quite interested in the Southwest. And you'd say that he flattered the performance of Silver Prospector, except that horse wasn't able to duplicate that performance in the Rebel. I think maybe the racetrack and just all the circumstances around the pace had a lot to do with that. Let's move on to another venue. We'll visit Aqueduct before we get to that other graded stakes racing from Santa Anita. We saw a pretty impressive performance at Aqueduct going back to this past Friday as Payne, a 5-year-old for Chad Brown, in his second start stretching out to the mile distance. He had done it once before in his previous start after racing as a sprinter for most of his career. Just seems like he's really found his niche as a miler now, because he was beating a much better allowance field in this race. And he got to the front pretty easily, but he really ran away from them in the stretch impressively.
Yeah, Payne really seems to have turned a corner. He was a horse who almost always ran well, but other than his maiden win, he had trouble finding the winner's circle, often at very short prices. But he has come back and rebounded. I think this was his third win in a row. He's run better speed figures each time, moving from a 107 3 starts back to a 118 last time. And he just looks like a horse who's figured out the game and knows what he's doing out there. I wouldn't even be surprised if this horse could go 2 turns because he just destroyed what's a pretty solid field in here. I mean, it's not like he beat up on a bunch of claimers. These were horses coming in with a lot of 115 and even 120 TimeformUS speed figures in their PPs, and he just destroyed them.
Yeah, he's one of these horses that I think has benefited from the change of running style that comes with stretching out in distance, because he had been one of these closing sprinters that would get a little keen early in his races, make those big looping moves on the turn, sometimes get tired in the stretch after moving too soon. And I think stretching out to these mile distances have allowed him to race closer to the pace and just get easier trips in general. So that's helped him show the talent that he's always had within him, because like you said, he's shown talent from the start. He's just really improving now that he's stretched out in distance. So it'll be interesting to see if Chad Brown elects to try a stakes race next time out. On Sunday at Aqueduct, we saw a pretty good group of New York breds in action in the Damon Runyon. In past years, I think this has been a race that's gone a mile and 16 that used to be run, I think, around 2 turns on the inner track. This year, they carted it at 7 furlongs on the main track, which is where they run now at Aqueduct in the winter. And this is a pretty good group of sprinters in New York right now, and Dream Bigger asserted that he probably is still the best of them. He really dominated some races towards the middle and end of last year. Went a bit off form in January. I think he lost the stakes at a short price to Silly Key, but he rebounded in a nice way here, leading from the start and just running away in the lane.
Yeah, he's a guy, he had kind of lost a couple in a row after a couple nice stakes wins that he had. And he was a horse that I thought maybe the others had just caught up. But I have to be honest, I don't know where this race came from. He got a 118 Timeform US speed figure. I think his previous best had been right around a 110 or something like that. He did have a pace advantage in here. On our pace projector, he was projected to get an easy lead to himself. But that's not really what happened. He did get challenged early. He had to go fast. All our fractions are coded in red, and he just kept right on going. He kind of ran all the others off their feet, and nobody could make up any ground. He was drawing away through the stretch. So just a really big effort. A 118 Timeform US speed figure for a 3-year-old this time of year is open company kind of numbers.
Yeah, I didn't know that he had this in him, and I always thought he was a horse that would struggle with distances beyond 6 furlongs because he had been fading in a lot of his recent races. But he finished off this 7 furlongs pretty strongly. And like you said, he had shown that early ability and kind of tailed off a bit, but he took a big step forward here, and we'll see if he can maintain it in the future. The others just didn't really step up to the plate. Silly Key, the horse that had defeated Dream Bigger in his when they met back in January, just seems like he's gone in the opposite direction. He lost a mile race last time and just continued moving and regressing here as he faded to finish last after trying to challenge Dream Bigger in the early going. And the others just aren't quite capable of achieving the kind of speed figure that Dream Bigger got in this race. Let's move out to Santa Anita, where we saw some pretty big speed figures posted on Saturday. The only grade 1 race of the weekend was run out there, that being the Beholder Mile for the older fillies and mares. And the headline attraction in this race was Hard Not to Love, who was coming off that grade 1 victory in the La Brea back in December. She had recently also won the Santa Monica. Both of those races were around 1 turn, going 7 furlongs. This was her first test going the 2 turns, this race being at a mile. And she didn't quite get the distance, but a horse who did, who was also trying 2 turns for the first time, was the winner, Cece, who really didn't have a whole lot go her way, going wide around both turns, but she was just better than Hard Not to Love on this day.
She was, and she's a horse you laid out a great case for her on the forecast. I kind of overlooked her, but everything you said turned out to be true. She came in just ready to roll, top form, didn't get a great trip, as you said, earlier, and she wound up with a 118 Timeform US speed figure for the win. So this is a race, it's a grade 1 in name. I probably wouldn't consider it a grade 1 as a handicapper going forward, maybe more like a grade 2. But that said, given the way she ran, I wouldn't be surprised if she could jump into grade 1 company and had a 120-ish or higher Timeform US speed figure in her arsenal, because this was a really big effort from her. Hard Not to Love, I thought, ran well. As we both suspected she would, but just thought the 2 turns would prove to be a problem, and it was for her against a horse like Cece. So I thought the top 2 ran really well. It was a big get back to Ollie's Candy in third, who was never really a factor, to be honest, and nor was anybody else. It always pretty much came down to these 2, and I look forward to seeing Cece go on and even run a little bit further, because she looks like a top filly to join an already strong group.
Yeah, what I will say about this race is that the pace was much faster than the other mile race we're going to talk about from Santa Anita on Saturday. Ollie's Candy really did go after Hard Not to Love on the lead in the early going, and maybe that just softened up Hard Not to Love enough to not be able to really finish off the race in the end, going this 2-turn distance. But Cece, like you said, the trip didn't work out for her. I looked up the Trackus numbers. She traveled 58 feet farther than Hard Not to Love, according to Trackus. So that's a significant margin going in a 2-turn race. And she just got the distance and drew off in the end. I mean, I had said last week that she's really bred to go the 2-turn distance, even though she hadn't done it before. And she seems like a lightly raced 4-year-old that's just really moving in the right direction right now. She's won her allowance race just prior to this in a sprint pretty easily. So it seems like there might be more left in the tank. We'll see how the racing calendar ends up shaking out, but she seems like one that could make some noise in this division as we progress on into the summer.
Yeah, and I totally agree with you about Hard Not to Love. I wouldn't give up on her going 2 turns based on this effort, because that's what I was saying. I thought she ran well, and given the pace scenario, with a little lighter pace up front, she could have certainly put up a bigger fight through the lane.
Now, the Grade 1 race that we saw at Santa Anita on Saturday was kind of overshadowed by the race of the same distance that took place just before it. An allowance has been for the 3-year-olds, where Bob Baffert's newest superstar, Charlatan, won by over 10 lengths. I don't think he was beating a whole lot, but boy, did he do it the right way.
Yeah, it wasn't the strongest of fields, but I mean, it wasn't terrible either. Great Power came in with a big reputation off his win. He had been working out well. Rushy had run some decent races. So, I mean, it wasn't like he was beating a field of claimers, and he just absolutely destroyed them. He kind of looked like a tank to me going into the turn and down the backstretch. He just looked like a bigger, stronger horse than the rest of them. And just, I mean, a really impressive effort. I mean, I hate to be the one to mention it, but he really does remind me of Justified, not just the campaign he's laid out, but the way he runs. And he's just a big, strong horse who looks like he can run all day, to be honest.
Yeah, it's hard not to point it out. There are just so many parallels between this horse and Justify. They both debuted in sprint races. They ran this mile allowance race in their second starts, won so easily. Their pedigrees are very similar because they both were bred speed over stamina. Justify had a really nice stamina foundation on the dam side, being by Scat Daddy. Charlatan is by Speightstown out of the dam Authenticity, who was a really nice runner going in dirt routes for Todd Pletcher a number of years ago with a real stamina-oriented female family. So there is a possibility that Charlatan could handle longer distances than this. I mean, just from watching him and from a physical standpoint, he moves like a Speightstown, and he's got kind of that quick action to him that would make you think that shorter distances would be best. But he just is able to maintain it over a longer distance, and he was finishing so strongly at the end of this mile race, like a horse who had just basically run a 1-turn race. I mean, he was running so quickly through the stretch, especially compared to the Beholder Mile that we just talked about. So there is some hope that he can go longer. And for an exciting horse like this, it seems like the time is now. We'll just see how he continues developing over the next several months, because it sounds like a lot of these top 3-year-old races might be months away at this point.
Yeah, and we should mention the pace. As you said, it was significantly slower than what we saw in the Beholder. His pace figure at the half mile was only a 1:12, so it was coded in blue by us. But he finished up with a final time figure of 1:25. His overall figure was a 1:23, I should mention, after a 1:22 in his debut. But, I mean, you just really have to love the way this horse finished the race. I mean, like you said, it looked like he had just jumped in at the 8th pole, as Trevor Denman says sometimes.
I was trying to avoid the cliche. It almost came out of my mouth, too. Speaking of Charlatan, we actually saw the horse that finished second to him in his maiden victory running on Sunday, dominating a maiden race. And when I watched this race, I almost couldn't believe that this horse went off at 5-1. But then I went back and looked at the field, and it was a pretty strong field that was finishing behind him. So I get why some other horses attracted a lot of support in here. But Shooter Shoot, who was coming off that second place finish to Charlatan, handled the stretch out to a mile and won this race in pretty fast time as well.
Yeah, he sure did. I haven't finished the speed figure for this. Actually, my assistant California does this one, but I'm pretty sure it's going to get about a 1:15. We're usually never more than a point apart or so when we look at each other's work. So it was a big effort for sure for trainer Peter Yurton. It was as you said, I was really surprised by the odds. It was a pretty strong field, but he had run really fast. It's not like Charlatan beat him by 15 lengths when he was runner-up. He got a 1:13 for the effort that day. Just a humongous effort from a maiden race. So really good effort, and just yet another 3-year-old in California that looks like a real runner.
Yeah, definitely one that could step up into stakes company soon. We'll see what distance he ultimately wants to go. He did survive a pretty honest pace here, so that bodes well for him stretching out further. I admit I did not look up his pedigree, so I don't know how far he's going to want to go based on that, but he had run his big prior speed figure in a sprint race, so we'll see what ultimately he's best at doing in the future. Let's move on to Laurel Park, where a really likable horse that named Arifana notched another victory. I believe she's lost just once in her career at this point in the Cumley last year at Aqueduct, but she's been basically unbeatable racing at Laurel, though she had to work pretty hard for this Nellie Morse win going a mile on Saturday as Horologist, who had run in some tough stakes races last year, got back into top form for Richard Baltus, and these two really put on a show to the wire.
They did, and they did so in fast time, too. There were tons of one-turn races at Laurel on Saturday, so it was an easy speed figure to make. And both her and Horologist got a 121, which is just a really nice number. It's the same one we gave to Serengeti Empress in the Arazi. Arifana is a horse who has always had the big reputation ever since her debut in Maryland. She came up to Saratoga and was bet, won an allowance race against a pretty strong field that day. And before finally, as you said, losing in the Cumley. But the one thing about her is she had never really run all that quick and you know, to back up that reputation. But she did it here, and being by Curlin, newly turned 4-year-old out of an AP Indy mare, it's probably not surprising that she's just going to keep getting better as she gets older.
Yeah, and her trainer, Kelly Rubley, I was looking at her stats in the Mid-Atlantic region recently. I mean, she's winning at a very high rate, and I know she does a very good job with a lot of her horses. And Arifana, obviously, is just a winning machine for her. And like you said, it was really encouraging to see her finally run a much faster speed figure here. And Horologist, I think it was a little bit less of a surprise for her because Horologist had run really well in some races last year, especially in that cotillion when she finished behind Street Band and Guarana. She had run, I think, close to a 120 TimeformUS speed figure that day. So she just got back into her top form here for the new trainer, Richard Baltus. I know she was coming off a disappointing effort recently, but she was able to rebound from that here, going back to the one-turn mile. And these two just finished far ahead of the rest of the field. I mean, not that they were slouches behind them. I mean, there are some nice stakes fillies that finished third or worse in this race, but they just weren't on the level of Arifana and Horologist, both of whom seemed like graded stakes horses.
Yeah, that's a good call. And to be honest, I had forgotten Horologist was now trained by Richard Baltus. I can't imagine he sent many to Laurel over the years, maybe a couple for the Fritchie or the General George. But yeah, it definitely looked like she's back in top form, too. She had won, I think it was the Monmouth Oaks before that effort in the cotillion. So she's definitely shown she can run some fast races. And I don't think there's any doubt she did here.
The other race of interest at Laurel Park on Saturday for the 3-year-olds was the private term stakes going a mile and a 16th. As we talked about on the TimeformUS forecast last week, a lot of these horses were trying the 2-turn distance for the first time. One of them who was doing that was not Lebda, though. He had tried it before, just hadn't been successful at it. But he was able to get the distance here, I think, under a much more patient ride from Alex Cintron, whereas last time in the Miracle Wood, they just sent him up towards the front end and he carved out some really ridiculous fractions and he was able to hold on in this private terms. They kept him well off a runoff leader in the early going. He gradually moved up to take over, and he just went geared down at the end.
He did. It was a good effort. I was impressed that he was able to rate a bit. He sat back in second and not just off the leader. He was well back of Took Charge, the sprinter who was stretching out for Chris Englehart. And he just ran a much more even race this time. If you look in our charts at his pace figures, the flow across the race is pretty consistent all the way through. Getting a little tired at the end, but he actually ran a 108 TimeformUS speed figure after only a 102 last time. So rationing that speed definitely helped. Both of our pick in the forecast, my friends, Spear ran a decent race to be second. He closed from well back to get a 101. So he ran the race we expected. Just Lebda ran better than we expected and ran a nice number. I don't think these are horses that we have to worry about in any of the big three-year-old races. I know Lebda, who knows what's going to happen with the Preakness and all that. Maybe he will be the local contingent. This race might be one that gets you in. I can't remember if it is or not, but these horses just aren't top 3-year-olds. They're just pretty solid stakes horses that, well, you know, the good local brand, the kind we both probably grew up following and attracted us to this game.
Yeah, Lebda's a nice horse, and he's He's been in over his head a couple of times. I think he was in that Dennis's Moment Iroquois last year. I think that was the prior time that he tried the 2-turn distance. But he does have real ability, and he showed it in that race going a mile in his previous start. I just think he's ultimately going to be better going a little bit shorter than a mile and a 16th. I mean, I know he got it here, but he was just better than these horses. We'll see. I would imagine him maybe being best in 7 furlong to a mile races moving forward. But obviously his connections might have some different things in mind after this victory. At Turfway Park on Saturday, we saw another Kentucky Derby prep, I suppose, one of the only ones that's left over synthetic track, that being the Jeff Ruby Stakes. I don't think we'll see too many Kentucky Derby starters coming out of this race, if any, though, because it's one of these synthetic races that was just dominated by turf horses, and no big surprise that Mike Maker was able to win this one with Field Pass.
No, not at all. I think him and Irad Ortiz swept this in the Bourbonette that we're going to briefly talk about next. I do want to bring up the speed figure for this race. I gave it a 106 tentatively. I wanted to get to it yesterday to kind of reevaluate. They had some real timing problems at Turfway on Saturday. The other 9 furlong race, which would have helped, was one that was just totally missed time. So I'm going to go back and time that one from video. The winner only got a 106 here, but I just want to bring up it's subject to change depending what I find today. It does seem a little low. I gave the winner of the Rush Away a 111 based on the clock. That was a race run at a distance where there weren't any timing problems. So I'm not saying it is a bad figure. I may leave it alone, but I just want to say it is up for debate at this point for me.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little low for a Kentucky Derby prep, although it does kind of fit the horses in this race because they're just a group of mediocre turf horses, really. I mean, Field Pass was coming off a victory in the Dania Beach at Gulfstream against a decent enough group, but a listed stakes group. So I don't really see a Field Pass going back to turf in the future and being one of the best out there. I think he just took advantage of the right circumstances in this race. The one horse who had run faster previously was the runner-up Invader, who's really developed into a synthetic specialist for Wesley Ward. He ran a nice race here, although I do think you have to note this is a race that was just dominated by horses that were occupying the top 3 positions throughout. Nobody really made any kind of run from the back of the pack. So just be aware of that as you're evaluating this race moving forward. The other big stakes race on Saturday at Turfway Park was that Bourbonette Oaks, which I guess you could consider a minor Kentucky Oaks prep. This one, again, was won by a horse who had been a turf specialist previously for the same connections as you mentioned, Irad Ortiz and Mike Maker at Queen of God, who I think was coming out of a race at, I want to say, Gulfstream, just like Field Pass was. And Queen of God got the trip here. She just ran down past the plate at the end of the race. These two running by Laura's Light, who was the big favorite here. Just seemed like that one didn't quite get the distance on the synthetic track.
Yeah, that's kind of why I said briefly about this race. Not really a whole lot to say about it. The winner only got 100 TimeformUS speed figure. The runner-up a 99. So it's just hard to take these races on synthetic too seriously because for the most part, these horses wind up being turf horses or synthetic specialists. And in this case, the figures just aren't good enough to make you think that when they jump it, if they try to jump in the graded competition back on turf, that they're really going to be very strong.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think they just had their day in the sun here on the synthetic track and which are races that just kind of happen in a vacuum these days because we don't see a whole lot of top racing over synthetic surfaces. So it doesn't have a whole lot of ramifications for when horses move back to dirt or turf. Final race we'll talk about on this podcast this Tuesday is the Hurricane Birdie, a grade 3 event from last Saturday at Gulfstream Park. And Craig, this was a good pick by you as Sally's Curlin looped the field, won from far back, passing them all in the stretch. This filly, or mare rather, was in a different zip code in the early going. I mean, they were going pretty fast up front, and she just dropped way out the back of the pack early, but she was able to pass them all in the stretch.
Yeah, she was. Watching the race, I wasn't too optimistic when I saw how far back she was. Like you said, she was somewhere, not maybe Fort Lauderdale, but it didn't look like Gulfstream. She was way out there. But it did set up the way we thought it might. Blamed and Pause for the Cause. We're going at it on the front end and just set it up as we've seen so often in these extended one-turn races at Gulfstream on the big days. If you get the setup, you can definitely win as a closer here. And Sally's Curlin took full advantage. He got a 1:15 TimeformUS speed figure for my friend CJ Johnson, who is one of the owners of this horse, and just a big effort, her second Grade 3 win. I was impressed with Pause for the Cause, who despite finishing third did kind of improve as I suspected she might, jump back up to a 1:16 TimeformUS speed figure. But that 7 furlongs and having to deal with blame was just a little bit too much to overcome in here.
And it should be noted that Blamed ended up finishing last in this race, much like she did in that same race that Pink Sands won, with a similar trip to what Sally's Curlin got. It just seems like Blamed is a horse that can't really withstand the kind of pace pressure that she gets in these fast-paced graded stakes races. So she's one of these need-the-lead type horses that just can't really take the heat up front. Pause for the Cause, I agree with you. She was the one that really caught my eye in this race because she dueled with Blamed and put that one away. And, I mean, she got run down by Sally's Curlin, but they all did at the end. And I thought Pause for the Cause stayed on pretty gamely to be third here. She obviously got the highest TimeformUS speed figure of anybody in this race, and she proved that her poor performance in the slop as the heavy favorite in her prior start up in New York really was just a fluky, sloppy track performance, because she got back to her better speed figures from when she was winning races last fall and into early winter. So I would hope that they send her back to New York after this, because she is a New York bred and she's fast enough to be dominating those races. So we'll see if they got some black type in the graded stakes for her, but I would like to see her back in New York. And Sally's Curlin, I mean, she's just one of these deep closers who will take advantage when they get the right pace set up. It's not going to happen all the time, and I don't think it even happens most of the time, but when it does, they can put in some pretty impressive late runs.
I do want to mention she is still just a filly. She's a newly turned 4-year-old. So being out of Curlin, I would suspect we may not have seen her best just yet.
Yeah, that's a good point. It'll be interesting to see how all of these horses develop in the coming months, however the racing landscape evolves. That's all the racing that we're going to recap on this week's podcast. As of now, I think we'll be back on Friday to do the usual TimeformUS forecast. It does sound like most racetracks out there that run major races are going to continue to race this weekend without spectators. We'll monitor all of those developments as they come out. But for now, I think everything is going to proceed as has been originally scheduled this week. As always, remember that you can listen to the TimeformUS Pacecast and the TimeformUS Forecast on DRF.com, Spotify, iTunes, YouTube, and SoundCloud, wherever you get your podcasts. Just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Forums channel. Thanks for listening this week, and we'll be back again to discuss some more races on Friday.